Well, these are just kind of our questions. Last week we discussed the history of voting rights, and we tried to cover as much as we could in the course of an hour. And these are kind of the entry level questions we wanted to do is that to establish the contemporary landscape and contemporary ecosystem of voting as we face it right now in Wisconsin. So we want to talk a little bit about Act 23, about voter ID laws, and then also just kind of the broader question of voting rights and how people can get involved. So let's start with Act 23. Who wants to? I'll throw up the alley oop. Who wants to give a first pass at its impact and actually what it is and its impact that it continues to have on student voters in the state?
I can take that unless somebody else wants to.
Go for it.
Okay. I was actually working at the American Civil Liberties Union when this act went into effect, so I know a lot about it. It was Act 23 of 2011, but we know it more broadly as the voter ID law. And even though it's called that, was a lot more. It was really a very broad voter suppression law. Voter ID was a big part of it, but there were a lot of components of that. And many of them had been fought in court for years, and a recent decision by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago reinstated a lot of the things that had been on hold because of previous successful cases. So, and one of those things was that has now been overturned was that it used to be up to the clerks to decide how much early voting that they would allow. So in Milwaukee and Madison, two of the largest cities in Wisconsin, you could have, several weeks of early voting, in-person early voting. So folks could go when they could. The impact on student voters for this, of course, is students have very strange schedules, right? And some of it's because their class schedules could be all over the place. They have work they're trying to fit in there. They have commutes potentially they're trying to fit in there. Being able to vote in person over a long period of time made a big difference for student voters and for all voters, really. That has now been turned back, and the clerks cannot expand early voting beyond the 2 weeks previous to the election. So that cuts back a lot of in-person voting time. But of course, the biggest thing about this was the student IDs that would be eligible to be used for photo ID. Our Fair Election Center, my employer, has a lawsuit right now. In fact, I just reviewed a brief we're about to submit to try to lift some of the requirements of those IDs because they're not used for anything. And actually the Seventh Circuit did us a little bit of a favor on that by agreeing that having an expiration date on a student ID that can be expired and still be used doesn't make any sense. These student IDs also have to have signatures on them, even though no one looks at that signature in the polling place and compares it to anything. If we win on those two things, every college ID in Wisconsin would be compliant with the voter ID law. So we're still working on that. But basically what they did was, on top of all the other things that are wrong with a photo ID law, they specifically carved out exceptions for college IDs that make no sense. The fact that even if you go to a four-year university, the ID has to have an expiration date not more than 2 years from issuance makes no sense. The fact that it has to have a signature makes no sense. It initially said it was supposed to have an address on it. And since college students use those IDs to get into their dorm rooms, you lose your ID and it's got your address on it. Anybody could grab that ID and get into your dorm room. I mean, so there were we got some of the fixes done, but it's yet another hurdle. And of course, as you all know, students have to not only have that ID that's compliant, they have to prove that they're enrolled at the same time. So it's very unfortunate that they carved out specific things to make it harder for students to vote. Luckily, groups like All Voting is Local and Andrew Goodman Foundation and the Campus Vote Project and all of the other great groups that we work with are working really hard to make sure that everyone understands what they need to vote, and we're not going to let this stop us.
Thanks, Kristen. That was very thorough. Does anybody want to add more to that? Peter, you want to add to that? And Bree, we're going to come to you because we want to hear about what students just feel and think about the ID issue. So we'll come to you in a sec. Peter, what else can you add to that for us?
I think a couple of things. Kristen covered so much of it. I think I would add how many students we're talking about in Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, and Kristen or somebody else, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are over 300,000 students at any given time in Wisconsin. So if students were their own city, right, it'd be the second largest city in Wisconsin. So it makes sense that legislation aimed at suppressing the power of the student vote or young people, I should say, in general, would target the student vote with these needless and discriminatory attempts to limit what can be used as a photo ID, student ID specifically. So I think that number is really powerful to think about. Also important to situate this in the early 2010s, a lot was happening. Wisconsin was not the only state passing photo ID laws. It was happening across the country.
Right.
This is happening right around the same time that the Voting Rights Act was gutted in the Shelby County case. Right. In Wisconsin in particular, we've got a redrawing of our districts, which we know has had a terrible impact on our democracy. So a lot happened in the early 2010s. And in Wisconsin, photo ID law was particularly horrific. And I think two other things. First, just to keep in mind that so many students are from out of state. So it's totally nonsense that an Illinois driver's license or a Minnesota driver's license, for example, can't count as a Wisconsin photo ID. Anything that proves your identity, if we're gonna have this photo ID law in place, which we can talk about separately, whether it's necessary, I don't think it is. But if this is going to be in place, we need as many options as possible for folks. And there's no reason that it should be exclusively a state driver's license or this narrow list of other options. And the evidence is pretty clear from 2016, the impact of this photo ID law. Study from UW-Madison found that likely over 16,000 voters in Dane and Milwaukee counties alone were deterred from voting because of this law, and scale that up to the statewide level, and it's pretty clear how suppressive this mechanism is.
Yeah, thanks. We appreciate the detail and the depth. Not only are students generally transient, even if they happen to live in the, let's say, Madison area, they can move every year. We for those of us who have the luxury to go to college, I feel like I was moving every 9 months, along with all the other stuff that goes on. But the college voters are also somewhat progressive. They don't vote in high numbers, but they typically vote far more left, and so there's obviously political consequences to that. Bree, talk to us as best as you can about just where students are with this stuff. What's the student pulse on, voter IDs and voting and politics? Just give us some insight.
Well, students right now, I feel like everyone is really weary about voting right now, whether it be coronavirus or whether it be, just how politics is running in general today. But as far as the voter ID, when I first went to go vote, I was not, I was still in high school. I turned 18 in high school. So, and I went to go vote and they said I didn't have a valid ID, but I'm it was valid, and I ended up leaving. And that was my first voting experience. So with me being going to a political science major, I wanted to come back. But some people, that being your first experience, you may never want to go back and vote again, with that. Because for one, it's kind of embarrassing to be turned away from anything, whether it's wherever you're at, you're being turned away to go vote. And then secondly, it just made it much more difficult. So I had to go to the DMV and go get a official Wisconsin ID because I just turned 18 and everything, and then come back for the actual election because I was a primary. I couldn't vote in and vote. And I was just this is a lot. But going into, being in school right now, I don't even think we can vote on campus because of coronavirus. So that's also another, obstacle that people probably don't want to go through to go vote. And it's really difficult trying to get, those absentee ballots sent out to dorms, things like that. So it's been a lot of obstacles right now for college students in specific. I would say high school students also, because I know like a lot of high school students, they're trying to vote as well. They don't really know what to do. So I think like something like this is important to even share with, high school teachers or, going to senior year, things like that. But because there are so many obstacles, and then you don't usually see, like you said, more college students are like more progressive voters and things like that. So you don't really see the candidates you always want. It's kind of, it becomes a lot on students and, young people to be like, oh, we're going to vote for this person and hopefully they'll win. But, then you get turned back. Now we have to vote because it's for a specific, party, stay within your party group. And a lot of young people don't really understand that mechanism. And I feel like they're going to turn away from it a lot of times. So that's one of the things in politics that don't really get talked about is, people are going to turn away from that, vote within party. They're just probably not going to vote at all, especially with all the obstacles on top of that. So politics in the younger community right now, I think people are not really as up for it as we used to be, as we were, back when, Barack was in office and everyone wanted to go be proactive about voting and get out there. Now it's just kind of like a duty at this point. Like they say, it's not something fun. It's more something like work, extra work you have to take on. That fits into your already you have a work schedule, school schedule, so you have to fit that in there. So it's not really, I would say, the best right now, but there's a lot of people who are trying to uplift, and that's why I say it's always important to go back and look at the history, because that's one thing I know young Black people who are in the movement, we always go back and look at the ancestors, look at the elders, and understand that they fought for us. So that's something that empowers us as well. So as long as we keep pushing the message of the history of voting, why it's important for us to vote, and that at some point, our voice will make a difference. I think that, that'll empower more young people to get out and vote.
Yeah,
I appreciate the point that you made. Just it was kind of across all three of yours, which is navigating bureaucracy is unpleasant for anybody of any age. But in particular, I mean, if you're younger, I mean, that point you made just culturally of like the feeling of going to something and someone saying, sorry, you have to leave, like that kind of fear, can push people away. And especially as there's this moving target of bureaucracy, right? Like where
Exactly.
our April election, it was like up until literally the day before, it was unclear where you should go or how it would work. So yeah, absolutely. The just creating bureaucracy and have it churn is a way of turning young people away.
Right.
That's kind of the broader issue with the whole Act 23. It wasn't just putting up all these roadblocks. It was making them, it was so much and it's so confusing that, a lot of people just go, forget it. And think, great for you, Bree, that you actually went back. A lot of people would have walked away from that first bad experience and went, you know what? They don't want my vote. I'm humiliated. Forget it. I'm not doing this anymore. A lot of people.
Yeah.
So good for you for not giving up.
Can I ask one question before, as we transition into the next section? I mean, one of the premises, so just to put this in play, of all the bureaucracy, all the different steps, all the different sort of hoops people need to jump through, is built around the premise of keeping voting safe and mitigating voter fraud. And, if I worked in any kind of professional setting, you kind of deal with the problems that are in front of you, not the ones that you've made up to deal with. So my question is, does anybody, you guys are experts on this kind of thing, do you know of there being widespread voter fraud among students or any vulnerabilities in the system as they exist that are causing the city of 300,000 people to be vulnerable to folks that want to disrupt the integrity of our elections? One word answer is fine.
To be honest with you, the only voter fraud that I am aware of, because it made it into the news, was mostly Republicans. Let's just be true. Overvoting there was one famous case in Shorewood where a man literally stole the IDs from his adult children's wallets, made copies, and then voted absentee in their names so that he could have a few extra votes for Scott Walker. He was prosecuted. There were a couple other cases which are kind of sad, of people who lose spouses, elderly people who still submit their dead spouses ballot.
Which college?
That person, and they also got caught. I don't know if they're prosecuted as strongly as the others, but
which college did they attend?
Yeah, they didn't really attend any colleges, and actually, there was not a single case brought up during all of the cases that I've read. Not a single case of a college student fraudulently voting.
If you're a student out there watching and trying to learn how to facilitate, the way that I just asked questions was very bad. Don't ask leading questions in that way. But Peter, what are you going to say?
I want to add more than a one-word answer. I mean, because obviously the answer is no to your original question. But if I could, like, this is a conversation I think we're all talking about. We're all talking about the integrity of our elections and what makes the integrity of our elections. So I believe an election with integrity is one that is free, fair, and accessible. And we can list out things that aren't free, fair, or accessible about our elections as they are. So, like a couple questions: what's free about 68,000 individuals serving a felony sentence being not eligible to vote until they complete the terms of their sentence? What is fair about a certain group of people in the assembly having 64% of the power, but only having received 46% of the vote in the last election? What is accessible about needing to get a driver's license or a photo ID at a Division of Motor Vehicles center when there are only 80 across 72 counties, and only 7 of those centers have Saturday hours, and those Saturday hours are only open 3.5 hours. So I think, like, I get very worked up, as you can tell, when we talk about anything related to fraud, because that is not the issue. The issue, similarly, in the topic of our integrity of our elections, but we need to be focusing on the list of things that make our elections not free, not fair, and not accessible.
And as you all begin to think about some of the topics you want to share relative to your organizations, let me add a little more historical context, because we need to call the voter ID laws what they are, and they are just the reincarnation or the long extension of Jim Crow era policies that deny folks the right to vote. They are intended to disfranchise as many people as possible. Our particular policy was passed under the auspices that it would prevent immigrants from voting fraudulently and felons from voting fraudulently. And that is nothing more than the racialized fears that we saw during the Jim Crow era informing policy and informing ways in which to limit the democratic process to folks, particularly people of color. Then, of course, when we think about the job-related challenges that come into play when you have to go get the right ID, you got to take time off work. There are costs associated with that. So then it begins to operate like a poll tax, right? And so, of course, for those of you who don't have to go through that, you're essentially grandfathered in. So in some ways, they have remnants of a grandfather clause in other ways. And so you have racialized imagery, you have finances being a part of the disfranchising process, and it's Jim Crow in the 21st century in so many ways, and it's just, I think it's important for us to call it what it is.
Yeah.
Well, you all may not be able to, because you obviously have to be nonpartisan, but I'm gonna call it what it is.
You're saying, like, I was just thinking about, like, the generational trauma and, like, me being turned away from voting, like me not understanding it back then, but now it was like, wow, something really must have hit me to be like, because I went home, I was sad, I was mad about it, and not to say that I was I wasn't into politics as much, but I really didn't care about the election. I just wanted to go vote. It was my first time voting. But I felt like really hurt by that. And it was a pain like I didn't really understand at the time because it wasn't something that I cared about, but it was something that people before me cared about. And that's why it hurt as much as it did. So like you were saying, it is just a reincarnation of, Jim Crow policies in today's time period. And the only reason behind it is to, like you said, keep specific groups from voting. Because there's literally no reason, as we heard, there's really no reason for it to exist, but it exists based off, like you said, racial lines and, just partisan lines as well, because we understand like who's is helping and who's is not helping. But.
Yeah.